Professor Kelinar's tentacles adjusted his holographic display with the kind of precise elegance that only came from centuries of academic superiority. The lecture hall at the Galactic Defense Academy buzzed with the soft hum of translation devices, climate regulators, and barely contained intellectual smugness. "Welcome, cadets, to Primitive Species Warfare Studies," Kelinar announced, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for discussing something distasteful yet educational. "Today, we examine the barbaric military practices of Sol 3's dominant species, humans. The class of 23 beings from across the galaxy settled into their ergonomic learning pods. Zephon, a massive four-armed Thraki, cracked his knuckles in sequence while reviewing his notes. The sound echoed like gunshots in the pristine chamber. "Professor," Quill interrupted, her telepathic tendrils twitching with curiosity, "surely you don't mean to suggest these humans pose any actual threat to civilized warfare doctrine?" A ripple of amused clicking, chirping, and harmonious laughter filled the room. Nyx, whose translucent Voltani form sparkled with internal light, practically glowed brighter with mirth. "Oh, my dear Quill." Kelinar's tentacles waved dismissively. "Absolutely not. These creatures represent everything our galactic civilization has evolved beyond. Violence without honor, tactics without dignity, warfare without any semblance of proper military etiquette." He gestured toward the main display, where archived footage began playing. The images showed human soldiers in crude, camouflaged uniforms carrying what appeared to be metal tubes that expelled small projectiles through chemical explosions. "Observe their primitive projectile weapons," Kelinar continued, zooming in on an assault rifle. "While we've mastered plasma, harmonics, and quantum disruption fields, these beings still rely on accelerated metal fragments. It's almost quaint, really." Zephon raised two of his four hands. "Professor, how do they even aim those things? There's no neural interface, no predictive targeting algorithms. Do they just point and hope?" "Precisely, Cadet Zephon. They use optical sight alignment and, I kid you not, manual trajectory calculation. Some even rely on instinct." The last word dripped with academic disdain. The class erupted in scandalized gasps and incredulous whistles. Vara, a serpentine Quilani whose species communicated through pheromone releases, actually shed her skin slightly from shock. "But surely," Nyx interjected, her voice chiming like crystal bells, "their command structure follows some form of tactical protocol. Even primitive species must have basic strategic frameworks." Kelinar's expression grew even more condescending, if such a thing were possible. "Oh, they have strategies. All right, watch this." The display shifted to show grainy combat footage. Human soldiers were scattered across a battlefield, taking cover behind debris, moving in seemingly random patterns, shouting incomprehensible orders at each other. "Notice the complete lack of formation discipline," Kelinar pointed out with obvious glee. "No synchronized movement patterns, no harmonic battle frequencies, no proper tactical formations whatsoever. They actually hide behind obstacles and shoot at enemies they can't even see properly." "How wonderfully inefficient," murmured Kex, a crystalline being whose faceted head rotated to get a better view. "Do they at least follow the galactic rules of engagement? Proper challenge protocols? Honor duels between commanding officers?" The professor's tentacles practically danced with amusement. "Rules of engagement? They have something called guerrilla warfare. They hide, ambush, retreat, and attack supply lines. They target infrastructure, disrupt communications, and, brace yourselves, they actually camouflage themselves to look like the environment." The horrors on his students' faces was palpable. Several aliens made gestures equivalent to crossing themselves, while others muttered prayers in their native languages. "Next week," Kelinar announced with obvious relish, "we'll examine their most egregious violations of civilized combat doctrine. I've obtained classified footage from the recent Terran hegemony conflict. You'll see firsthand why the Galactic Council classified their entire military methodology as crimes against tactical sensibility." The lecture hall's automated doors whispered open just as Kelinar was warming up to his favorite topic of human tactical inadequacy. Every head, tentacle, and sensory organ turned toward the entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the corridor's bright lighting. "Ah," Kelinar's voice carried a note of barely concealed irritation. "You must be our special exchange student." The figure stepped into the room, and 23 pairs of alien eyes took in what could only be described as the most unremarkable being they'd ever encountered. Average height, wearing simple dark clothing that looked like it came from a civilian market, brown hair that seemed to have been cut with functional efficiency rather than style, and hands that hung casually at his sides. "Marcus Blake," the human said simply, his voice carrying no particular accent or inflection. Sorry I'm late. Had to find the right lecture hall. The silence stretched for exactly 3.7 seconds before Kelinar's academic politeness kicked in. Of course. Of course. Class, this is a wonderful opportunity. We have an actual specimen, representative of the species we've been studying. Kelinar's tentacles gestured enthusiastically. Please, Marcus Blake, take any available seat. Marcus nodded and moved toward the back of the room, passing rows of staring aliens. His footsteps made soft sounds against the polished floor. Completely ordinary, and somehow that ordinariness made him even more fascinating to observe. Quill leaned towards Zephon, her telepathic whisper barely audible. He looks so normal. Are we sure this is the same species that caused all that tactical chaos? Maybe he's defective, Zephon whispered back, all four arms crossing in contemplation. I expected something more feral. Nyx's crystalline form sparkled with suppressed amusement. Look at those clothes. No armor plating, no weapon hardpoints, no tactical enhancement ports. How does he even survive combat? Marcus settled into a seat in the back corner, crossing one leg over the other in a relaxed pose that suggested he was completely comfortable being the center of attention without acknowledging it. His eyes scanned the room once, taking in each alien species with what appeared to be mild curiosity, then focused forward on the professor. Excellent, excellent, Kelinar continued, clearly delighted by this turn of events. Now, as I was saying, we'll be examining the complete breakdown of military protocol during the Terran hegemony conflict. Marcus, I hope you won't take offense, but your species' approach to warfare is, well, let's call it unconventional. Not at all, Professor, Marcus replied, settling back in his chair. I'd be interested to hear your analysis. Vara, the Quilani, released a pheromone burst that translated roughly to amused condescension. This should be educational for all of us, she hissed softly to her neighbors. Kex rotated his crystalline head toward Marcus. Perhaps you can provide insight into why humans choose such inefficient combat methods. Marcus smiled, a small expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and completely unreadable. I'm sure the professor's research speaks for itself. The following week arrived with all the anticipation of a public execution. Kelinar had spent the entire interval preparing his most damning presentation yet, but complete with tactical analysis overlays and cultural commentary that would surely cement his reputation as the galaxy's foremost expert on primitive warfare. Today, my dear students, Kelinar announced with theatrical gravity, we examine the absolute nadir of military conduct. The Terran hegemony conflict produced documentation of human warfare that violates no fewer than 47 articles of the Galactic Combat Accords. The lights dimmed as classified footage began streaming across the main display. The first scene showed a human settlement under siege by hegemony forces. Towering war machines advanced across pristine battlefields, their plasma cannons charging with dignified, predictable patterns. Notice the proper formation of hegemony forces, Kelinar pointed out with obvious approval. Synchronized advance, regulated weapon discharge intervals, appropriate challenge protocols broadcast on all frequencies. This is how civilized warfare should appear. Then the footage shifted, and the collective intake of breath from 23 alien species filled the lecture hall. Human defenders weren't lined up in neat formations. Instead, they scattered like startled insects, taking cover behind rubble inside damaged buildings, even underground in what appeared to be hastily dug tunnels. Worse yet, they were shooting at the advancing war machines from concealed positions. Observe the complete abandonment of honorable combat doctrine. Kelinar's voice dripped with disgust. No formal battle lines, no declared champions, no opportunity for surrender negotiations. They simply hide and attack without warning. Quill's telepathic tendrils recoiled as if she'd touched something unclean. They're not even facing their enemies directly. How can there be honor in combat if opponents don't acknowledge each other properly? The footage continued, showing humans fashioning weapons from industrial equipment, turning civilian vehicles into mobile weapon platforms, and coordinating attacks through primitive radio communications that sounded like barely controlled mayhem. Here we see improvised explosive devices. Kelinar paused the image on a crude contraption made from fertilizer and scrap metal. Rather than engaging in proper weapons craft, they create these abominations from household materials. Zephon's forearms gestured in bewilderment. Why not simply purchase regulation military equipment? Do they lack proper manufacturing capabilities? That's exactly the point, Cadet Zephon. The professor replied with obvious satisfaction. They're so technologically primitive that they must resort to these barbaric alternatives. Nyx's crystalline form flickered with what her species expressed as moral outrage. Professor, are those humans actually targeting supply convoys, non-combatant logistics personnel? The footage showed human forces ambushing hegemony supply lines, destroying food shipments, medical supplies, and communication equipment. The attackers struck from multiple directions simultaneously, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Indeed, Cadet Nix. They completely disregard the sacred distinction between military and support personnel. Supply convoy crews are protected under 17 different galactic treaties, yet humans treat them as legitimate targets. Kex rotated his faceted head in confusion. But surely this behavior is counterproductive. It disrupting supply lines only prolongs conflict. Civilized warfare seeks swift, decisive resolution through direct combat between military forces. Precisely why their methodology is classified as criminal, Kelinar replied, clearly enjoying his students' shocked reactions. Watch this next segment, Psychological Warfare. The display showed human propaganda broadcasts, complete with images of destroyed hegemony equipment and captured personnel. The humans were actually using their enemies' own communication networks to spread demoralizing messages. They broadcast images of their victories across hegemony channels. Kelinar explained with obvious revulsion. Rather than maintaining proper military secrecy, they actively worked to damage enemy morale through information warfare. Vara released a pheromone burst that roughly translated to moral contamination detected. How can combat have meaning if psychological manipulation replaces honest military prowess? The alien students frantically took notes, their various appendages working overtime to document every violation of civilized warfare they witnessed. Several beings made cultural gestures indicating gratitude for their own species' evolved military ethics. In the back corner, Marcus Blake sat perfectly still, his expression remaining neutral as he watched footage of his own species being dissected like specimens under a microscope. His hands rested calmly on the desk surface, and occasionally he would nod slightly, as if confirming the accuracy of the professor's tactical analysis. The next sequence of footage began with what appeared to be a routine hegemony mechanized assault. 3 towering war machines, each standing 30 meters tall and bristling with plasma cannons, advanced across a urban battlefield toward a cluster of human defensive positions. Zephon leaned forward in his seat, all forearms crossing as he studied the tactical display. Something about the scene nagged at his military-trained mind, but he couldn't quite identify what. Here we observe a classic example of human tactical desperation. Kelinar continued, manipulating the display controls with obvious relish. 3 greater hegemony assault mechs against approximately 50 human defenders. Any civilized force would recognize the futility and request honorable surrender terms. The footage showed the human forces scattering as expected, taking cover behind rubble and damaged buildings. Standard guerrilla response. Completely predictable according to everything they'd studied about primitive warfare doctrine. Then one human soldier moved differently. Instead of seeking cover, this figure sprinted directly toward the advancing mechs, he carrying what appeared to be nothing more than a standard issue rifle and a backpack full of improvised equipment. The camera angle shifted, following this lone figure as he weaved between plasma blasts with movements that seemed almost calculated. Fascinating, Kelinar mused, zooming the display for a better view. This individual appears to be attempting some form of suicide assault, typical human disregard for tactical probability. But Zephon's enhanced eyesight caught something the professor missed. The running human's face turned toward the camera for just a moment, and those features, those exact proportions. "Professor," Zephon interrupted, his voice carrying a strange note of uncertainty. "Could you enhance that facial image?" "Of course, Cadet. An excellent observation opportunity." The display magnified, focusing on the human soldier's face as he sprinted between the massive war machines. Clear brown eyes, determined expression, that same unremarkable haircut, those same ordinary features that were sitting quietly in the back row of their classroom. The silences that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of 23 alien minds processing the impossible coincidence they were witnessing. Quill's telepathic tendrils went rigid with shock. Nix's crystalline form flickered rapidly between colors. Vara actually molted a complete layer of skin in surprise. "That's," Kex began, his rotating head swiveling between the screen and the back corner, where Marcus sat. "Impossible," whispered Quill. On screen, the human soldier who looked exactly like their classmate had somehow reached the first mech and was climbing up its leg assembly with impossible speed and precision. In real time, they watched him place what appeared to be crude explosive charges at specific joint locations, then leap clear just as the 30M war machine collapsed in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Remarkable luck, Kelinar commented, completely oblivious to his students' shock. Primitive explosives shouldn't have been capable of penetrating grade A armor plating. The human must have found some structural weakness through pure chance. But the footage wasn't finished. The same soldier was already moving toward the second mech, he this time carrying a different improvised weapon that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts in sheer desperation. He slid beneath the machine's weapon tracking systems, attached something to its power coupling, and rolled clear just as the entire mech shut down like a switched-off light. 2 lucky strikes, the professor mused. Statistically improbable, but humans do seem to excel at random chance. The third mech had identified the threat and was turning its full arsenal toward the lone human figure. Plasma cannons charged, targeting systems locked on. Probability of survival calculated at 0.0000%. The human on screen smiled. It was the same small, unreadable expression they'd seen from Marcus Blake just minutes earlier. Then he pulled out what appeared to be a handheld communications device, spoke into it briefly, and suddenly the entire battlefield erupted in coordinated chaos. Hidden human forces emerged from concealment in perfect synchronization and are taking the third mech from 17 different angles simultaneously, while their apparent leader calmly walked away from the destruction. In the back of the classroom, the real Marcus Blake's smile widened just slightly. Fascinating example of primitive pack-hunting behavior. Kelinar continued, still completely missing the connection his students had made. Notice how they waited for their alpha to signal the attack. Very similar to lower mammalian species we've studied. Zephon's 4 hands were trembling slightly. Professor, what was that soldier's name? Let me check the tactical database, Kelinar replied, calling up additional information. According to hegemony intelligence reports, this particular individual was designated as Sergeant Marcus Blake, Human Armed Forces Special Operations Division. The professor paused, looking confused. Odd coincidence that, same name as our exchange student. The classroom's advanced environmental systems registered a sudden spike in stress pheromones, elevated heartbeats, and what could only be described as collective existential panic. 23 alien minds were rapidly connecting dots that formed a picture none of them wanted to see. Quill's telepathic abilities, normally kept under strict ethical control, extended involuntarily toward the humans sitting in the back corner. What she encountered nearly knocked her unconscious. Flashes of tactical brilliance, split-second decisions that saved thousands of lives, the systematic analysis of 17 different alien species combat weaknesses, and battle plans drawn up in dirt with sticks that had defeated computer simulations running on quantum processors. Victory after impossible victory, each one carved out through a combination of creativity, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to predict enemy behavior. She jerked back from the mental contact, her tendrils recoiling as if she'd touched a live plasma conduit. Professor, her voice barely managed to remain steady, could you show us the tactical summary for the entire Terran hegemony conflict? Kelinar, delighted by his students' sudden academic enthusiasm, pulled up a galactic map dotted with battle markers. Red dots indicated hegemony victories. Blue dots marked human successes. The map was overwhelmingly blue, as you can see. The professor continued with obvious satisfaction at having such engaged pupils. The humans managed several lucky victories through their primitive tactics. However, you'll notice that most of these successes cluster around specific operational theaters. Zephon's military training kicked in, and he began analyzing the pattern with growing horror. Professor, those aren't random victories. Look at the timing, the geographical progression, the tactical evolution between engagements. What do you mean, cadet? Each battle builds on the previous one. The tactics get more sophisticated, more precisely targeted to specific enemy weaknesses. This isn't luck or primitive desperation. This is systematic, strategic development. Nyx's crystalline form was flickering through color spectrums that indicated severe emotional distress. Professor, could you show us the personnel files for the human commanders involved in these victories? The display shifted to show military records. Name after name scrolled past, but one designation appeared with disturbing frequency. Sergeant Marcus Blake, Strategic Operations Specialist. Kexis's rotating head moved like a targeting system between the screen and the back of the classroom. Professor, according to these records, this Marcus Blake individual was involved in 93% of successful human operations. Impossible, Kelinar scoffed. No single individual could have that level of operational involvement. The database must have corrupted entries. But Vara was studying the tactical signatures, with her species' natural pattern recognition abilities. Professor, look at the weapon modification patterns. The improvised explosive placements, but the communication timing protocols. They're identical across all engagements. The footage continued playing, showing battle after battle where human forces, led by the same unremarkable-looking soldier, systematically dismantled hegemony advantages through tactics that seemed to violate every principle of civilized warfare while being devastatingly effective. Here we see the Battle of Kepler Station, Kelinar announced, pulling up footage that made several students physically recoil. The humans actually turned the station's own defensive systems against our forces through what can only be described as technological vandalism. On screen, Sergeant Marcus Blake was calmly rewiring alien computer systems with nothing more than basic tools and an apparently intuitive understanding of 17 different species technological psychology. Notice the complete disregard for proper hacking protocols. The professor continued. No authentication requests, no system respect negotiations, no data dignity acknowledgements. They simply break in and reprogram everything. The real Marcus Blake, sitting quietly in the back corner, shifted slightly in his seat. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was paying very close attention to the technical analysis. The most disturbing aspect, Kelinar went on, warming to his theme, is the psychological manipulation involved. This Blake individual seemed to understand exactly how each species would react to specific stimuli. It's almost as if he had studied us like laboratory specimens. More footage rolled. Marcus Blake on screen was orchestrating what appeared to be chaos, but revealed itself upon closer examination to be precision psychological warfare. Hegemony forces were being manipulated into making tactically disastrous decisions through carefully orchestrated scenarios that exploited their cultural conditioning and military doctrine. Here he's actually using our own honor codes against us, the professor pointed out with obvious disgust. He challenges a hegemony commander to single combat, then has snipers eliminate the officer during the formal combat declaration, completely barbaric violation of engagement protocols. Quill couldn't stand it anymore. Professor, what was the final casualty count for the Terran hegemony conflict? Kalinar's tentacles stopped moving. Well, that's classified. But since we're in an academic setting, the hegemony lost approximately 60% of its military assets and was forced to withdraw from the Terran system entirely. The silence that followed was deafening, and this was accomplished, Zephon said slowly, primarily by the actions of this one human soldier. Among others, certainly, but yes, Sergeant Blake's operations were responsible for the majority of strategic defeats that led to the hegemony's withdrawal. The professors pulled up one final piece of footage showing a human settlement celebrating victory. In the center of the celebration, Sergeant Marcus Blake was being decorated by his commanders, his face clearly visible as he accepted what appeared to be their highest military honors. This individual, Kelinar declared with obvious contempt, represents everything primitive about human warfare. Reckless, unpredictable, completely lacking in proper military courtesy. A prime example of how barbaric species approach organized conflict. From the back of the classroom came a quiet, measured voice. Actually, Professor, I think you've got the timeline wrong on that battle. Every sensory organ in the room focused on Marcus Blake as he stood up slowly, his movements carrying the same casual confidence they'd witnessed in the combat footage. The resemblance was no longer coincidental. It was undeniable. The Kepler Station engagement didn't happen on Galactic Standard Day 2847. Marcus continued, walking toward the front of the classroom with unhurried steps. It was day 2849. I remember because we had to wait for the hegemony fleet to finish their formal challenge protocols before we could disable their computers. Professor Kalinar's tentacles froze mid-gesture. How could you possibly know such specific details? Marcus reached the front of the room and turned to face the class, that same unreadable smile playing across his features. Because I was there, Professor. I planned it. The silence stretched until Nix finally managed to whisper, You're him. You're actually him. Sergeant Marcus Blake, Human Armed Forces Special Operations Division, he confirmed with a slight nod. Though I'm retired now, these days I prefer Professor Blake. Kelinar's worldview was cracking like poorly constructed armor plating. But you're so ordinary. Unremarkable. How could someone like you have defeated the most advanced military force in the galaxy? Marcus gestured toward the frozen battle footage on the display. That's exactly why it worked, Professor. You were so convinced of your superiority that you never considered we might actually understand you better than you understood yourselves. He walked over to the tactical display and manipulated the controls with easy familiarity. Every one of these so-called primitive tactics was specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in alien military psychology. The improvised weapons. We knew your forces would underestimate anything that didn't look properly manufactured. The guerrilla warfare? Your honor codes prevented you from adapting to asymmetric combat. Zephin's four arms hung limply at his sides. You studied us. Yeah, for 3 years before the conflict even began, Marcus confirmed. We analyzed every species in the hegemony. Combat doctrine, cultural values, technological dependencies, psychological profiles. The war crimes Professor Kelinar described weren't violations of civilized warfare. They were precisely targeted psychological operations designed to make your forces defeat themselves. The professor's academic authority was evaporating like atmosphere from a breached hull. But the unpredictability, the chaos, the complete lack of proper military structure. Marcus smiled wider, was carefully orchestrated to appear chaotic while actually following very specific strategic objectives. We let you think we were primitive because primitives aren't threatening, right up until they win. He turned back to address the stunned class. Which brings me to why I'm really here. The Galactic Defense Academy has contracted me to develop a new curriculum. Advanced unconventional tactics will be required coursework for all military cadets starting next semester. The irony hit the room like a physical force. The alien species who had spent the morning studying human barbarism were now going to be taught by the human who had used that barbarism to defeat them. The first lesson, Marcus continued cheerfully, will be titled Why Your Enemy's Weakness is Your Advantage. Class begins Monday. 3 weeks later, the same lecture hall hosted a very different kind of class. Professor Kelinar sat in the front row frantically taking notes like a first-year cadet, while Marcus Blake stood at the instructor's podium with the casual authority of someone who had actually won a galactic war. Today, we're going to discuss adaptive tactical thinking. Marcus announced, gesturing toward a holographic display showing various alien military formations. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with these standard hegemony attack patterns? Zephin raised 2 of his 4 hands tentatively. They follow regulation protocols. Exactly, Cadet Zephin. They're completely predictable. When your enemy knows exactly what you're going to do, they can prepare accordingly. Marcus manipulated the display to show counter-strategies. Human forces didn't win because we were stronger or more technologically advanced. We won because we were impossible to predict. Quill's telepathic tendrils twitched with confusion. But, Professor Blake, how can military operations function without standardized procedures? How do you coordinate forces without established protocols? Marcus smiled, the same expression that had once terrified hegemony commanders across 17 star systems. You adapt in real time. Watch this. He called up footage from the Battle of Proxima Ridge, where human forces had defeated a hegemony armored division using nothing more than creativity and kitchen utensils. Notice how the human squad leader doesn't follow any predetermined tactical manual, Marcus pointed out. He sees an opportunity, communicates it to his team through improvised signals, and executes a plan that was invented approximately 30 seconds before implementation. Nyx's crystalline form flickered with what her species expressed as intellectual vertigo. But how do subordinates know what to do if there's no standardized command structure? They think for themselves, Marcus replied simply. Every human soldier is trained to be a tactical problem solver, not just a protocol follower. That's why your forces kept losing. You were fighting an army of individuals who could adapt faster than your command computers, could process new scenarios. Former Professor Kelinar raised a tentacle hesitantly. Professor Blake, how were you able to understand our psychological weaknesses so thoroughly? Marcus leaned against the podium, his posture relaxed and conversational. Because you published detailed academic papers about your own military philosophy, your species wrote entire books explaining exactly how you approach warfare, what you consider honorable, and what tactical choices you would never make under any circumstances. The room fell silent as 23 alien minds processed this revelation. We read your literature, studied your cultural values, and analyzed your historical conflict, Marcus continued. Then we did everything you said civilized species would never do. It wasn't primitive warfare, Kelinar. It was asymmetric psychological operations based on comprehensive intelligence analysis. Vara molted slightly from embarrassment. So when you violated our rules of engagement, we were exploiting your assumption that everyone shared your rules, Marcus finished. Your biggest weakness wasn't technological or tactical. It was intellectual arrogance. Kex rotated his head in what his species displayed as grudging respect. Professor Blake, what's the most important lesson for military officers to learn? Marcus walked toward the classroom, exit pausing at the door for his final observation. Sometimes the best strategy is the one your enemy would never expect because they've convinced themselves it's impossible, immoral, or beneath their consideration. He looked back at the assembled aliens, former enemies who were now eager students hanging on his every word. The moment you decide you're too civilized, too advanced, or too superior to learn from your opponents, you've already lost the war. Class dismissed. As the door closed behind him, 23 of the galaxy's most advanced species sat in contemplative silence, finally understanding that evolution wasn't always about becoming more complex. Sometimes it was about becoming more adaptable. In the hallway, Marcus Blake smiled to himself and headed toward his next class, Psychological Warfare 101, Understanding Your Enemy Better Than They Understand Themselves. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place.